Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Arpit Chaturvedi. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Envipol. Welcome to our New York Climate Week event. We have a great discussion coming up for you on the topic of rethinking international climate policies. That's our first panel. I'm extremely glad to have three very eminent thinkers and scientists and policy advisors on the field of climate change with us today. We have Professor Michael Oppenheimer. He's the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is credited to have organized and co-organized a series of activities that prefigured the emergence of climate change as a top international concern and influenced the development of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Professor Oppenheimer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me today.
Next, we have Dr. Wendy Schultz. She is the Director of Infinite Futures, Foresight Research and Training, Oxford, England. She's an academically trained futurist with over 35 years of global foresight practice. She has designed futures research projects for NGOs, government agencies, and businesses, and recently completed 4 global scenarios and multiple regional scenarios on the futures of research and innovation in a post-COVID world. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. Many of you might have also interacted with Dr. Schultz during our GPOTS Fellowship, where she was a mentor, and in our previous London Climate Action Week event last year. So, Dr. Schultz, such a pleasure to have you over here with us once again.
It's an honor.
And last but not the least, we have Professor Bela Fox-Kemper, who's a professor of Earth, Environment, and Planetary Sciences, coordinating lead author of the Ocean, Cryosphere, and Sea Level Change chapter of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, August 2021. I would encourage whoever is here to read the summary for policymakers for that report, which I thought was extremely useful. Thank you so much, Professor Fox-Kemper, for joining us over here, even though you are jet-lagged. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Fox-Kemper has just landed into London, as he told me last night. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for joining us on a weekend. Already shows the passion and the commitment that you have towards climate change, and coming up with some of the innovative and impactful policies in this regard. Now, first, my question is to Professor Oppenheimer. Professor Oppenheimer, one of the mainstays of the success of climate policy internationally has been the availability of finance. You mentioned in an interview that you are skeptical of the accounting standards when it comes to climate finance. You said, and I quote, "By some reckoning, public funds have leveraged sufficient private capital so that the commitment to $100 billion about the accounting, and I'm somewhat skeptical. It's always the same problem. What would have happened anyway? What was just reprogrammed and is not new money, or was it just fake?" End quote. So my question over here is that if finance is a core success parameter to address climate change, and if most nations and players in the private sector see it as a burden to contribute real money for climate change, what could be some measures to induce nations and private sector to contribute funds without paying lip service or without what we typically say greenwashing?
Well, it's a great question, and it's been a problem for a long time. First, let's keep in mind that governments have made foreign assistance commitments outside of the climate regime and inside of it for decades, including the ones in the UNFCCC, and then often just failed to live up to them. So the value of these pledges may be more aspirational than realistic. However, governments understand that. The donor governments understand it, and the recipient governments understand it. And it's a recognition, essentially, that understanding of the fraud politics in donor countries on the one hand, and the demands for assistance on the part of recipient or potential recipient countries. Though the latter countries have substantial leverage in the climate negotiations, and for them, this sort of assistance, like the Green Climate Fund, that's a key demand. So that progress in the negotiations basically hangs on the ability of both sides to agree to sums that are to be donated by the donor countries, but which everybody realizes it's going to be hard to live up to because of the political realities in those countries. One way to resolve this conflict seems to have been for governments now arguing that public funding is meant to leverage much larger private funds, and it's the sum of the two that should count. So over time, what's happened is that non-governmental organizations have come to play a significant role in monitoring these activities to see if, in fact, the funds are leveraging additional investment, which is very hard to do. And I expect that role to expand over time. However, someone needs to pay for monitoring. It's not cheap. It in itself requires money, and the non-governmental sector isn't rich. And in order to do the job properly, you need some way to give an official imprimatur, perhaps by the UNFCCC itself, that this job is being done well. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to know if the results are meaningful. We have analogous experience with the green certification programs for, say, timber or fisheries, where there are numerous programs. They have different criteria, and it's hard to know sometimes which is doing a good job. And governments, theoretically at least, and sometimes in reality, have played a role in certifying the certification programs. However, one problem is always going to remain, and that's especially because private sector finance can be opaque. Governments, have often certain standards of transparency for themselves, although, it's not clear they live up to those either. Yeah. But, the private sector, the key question is, which money would have been spent anyway? Which money is really new money in the climate change venture? And that's the hardest thing to know. And especially with the private sector, because you can't always tell, or different government aid programs, which have nothing to do with climate change, but they can be relabeled. So I'm not sure, I don't have a ready answer for how to get around that part of the problem, but there is experience with the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism that may be useful here. I'm not so much of an expert on that, so I'll leave it to others to explore.
Certainly, and just a quick follow-up. What incentive structures do you think could be put in place? Do you think that negative incentives such as taxes to increase contributions towards climate change, perhaps levied on the private sector, maybe it's time just to do that?
Well, if you mean an internationally imposed tax, I don't think it's politically feasible. Sure. A lot of countries just won't do it, and they're the same countries that actually are the so-called donor countries. Taxes on individuals work within countries, and they do help shape environmental behavior, taxes and other financial incentives. But I don't think that that's where the answer to the question lies. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that the Paris Agreement itself is essentially voluntary, except for the reporting commitments. And so, for instance, countries attaining their nationally determined contributions, there's no penalty if they don't, except for the opprobrium from other countries. And I think with the question of assistance, we have the same problem. In the end, you have to rely on information, transparency, and the goodwill of the donor nations, and also the goodwill of the recipient nations in spending the money appropriately.
Absolutely. And indeed, those are perennial debates and political challenges of convincing the donor nations to actually make good on their commitments, and for the receivers to responsibly spend those funds. Now, let me move on to Professor Fox-Kemper over here. My question to you, Baylor, is that in the 6th assessment report of IPCC, you, along with other researchers, lay out 5 illustrative scenarios that cover the range of possible future development of anthropogenic drivers of climate change found in the literature. Can you very briefly walk us through those scenarios? And I have a follow-up question to that, which I'm going to ask just right away, that in addition to CO2 reductions, what are some of the other priority areas you think policymakers should be focused on?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for, I think this is a great question to really get into, particularly for people who would like to read the reports and understand what they say. This is a pretty technical aspect of how we categorize the potential futures. I'm part of the Working Group 1 report, which is the physical sciences basis, as opposed to the adaptation or mitigation working group, which come afterward. But even within the physical sciences basis, we would like to have a range of illustrative potential futures. That's what we use to drive the climate models. And this is a practice that goes all the way back to the beginning, first days of the IPCC, coming up with these kind of shared experiments that would be run by modeling centers all around the world, each contributing an outcome that results from the same protocol or same experimental setup. Let me show you, let me share a screen briefly.
Sure.
So this is a nice figure from a 2020 paper by Malta Meinhausen and others. And this gives a rough idea of what the SSPs do. SSP stands for Shared Socioeconomic Pathway. And so first it's observations, and this is showing temperature in this direction, and then the past comes up to the present and then splits into multiple futures. And the multiple futures have a first number, which says sort of what kind of a planet we're living on. Is it a fossil fuel development planet? Is it a sustainability planet? Is it a middle of the road or regional rivalry? A planet that features strong inequality or tries to reduce inequality? Those are the kinds of basic settings that the designers of these experiments considered. And then within each of those, there could be multiple levels of temperature outcome, or really greenhouse gases and aerosol outcomes. And so what these ones that are shown in dark, the 5 dark ones here, are the 5 primary or tier 1 forcings that we used for the 6th assessment report. Okay. And you might say, okay, this is very complicated. There are lots of background pieces. What do these each include? Well, they give you not only a historical record of things like carbon dioxide emissions, but also methane, chlorofluorocarbons, other greenhouse gases, so halons, those kind of things. But also land use change, population change that goes along with that, which is different among these different scenarios and goes with the land use change as well, and aerosols. So some of the cooling agents, so the soot that actually works in the opposite direction tends to cool the earth, that in addition to human activities, products of human activities that tend to warm the earth. So all of that is put together in these complicated forcing scenarios. And they're meant to be illustrative rather than very realistic, but they try to make them kind of something that you can get an idea of the span of possible scopes. And it's not only physically possible, but it's sort of economically and socioeconomically possible. They each have a second number. So you can see down here the SSP1 2.6 or SSP1 1.9. That second number gives you a sense of how out of balance the Earth system is in terms of watts per meter squared of warming at the end of this trajectory. And so the bigger numbers there mean the Earth is really warming very quickly. SSP 585 has 8.5 watts per meter squared approximately of warming at the end, whereas SSP 1.9 is only 1.9. And so now you could say, well, what are these? Now let me give you my personal opinion about what these really relate to. So the nice thing about the second number is it gives us a backwards compatibility. We can look back to previous reports that used different forcing scenarios, but had a similar kind of tuning number at the end. Those were called the representative concentration pathways, which is just another jargon term. But we can compare to previous reports to the new report because there's some similarity between those protocols of the earlier reports.
Sure.
So of course, it's extremely important to understand how science moves forward each time these reports come out, about every 7 or 8 years. Each time we'd like to know whether the models are different this time around or the same. We have new outlooks. So that's part, building in that backward compatibility with the old experiments is important. So, but you might say, well, what are these end members? Are these even realistic or possible? There's been a lot of discussion, particularly by folks in the energy industry, to argue that the SSP 585 is unrealistically hot, too much warming. It would require building tens of thousands of new coal production facilities to get to those level of emissions. And I would say similarly, the SSP 1.9 is also pretty hard to get to. It would be a radical change of our energy system very fast in order to get there.
Sure.
So those are the end members, but I think scientifically, it's very important to have those end members, because one of the things we're doing is we're exploring the range of possibilities. Maybe there's a tipping point that sits between SSP 3 and SSP 5 that we wouldn't know was there unless we ran the SSP 5 experiment. And we might be wrong about exactly where it sits. It might actually sit over here between SSP 2 and 3.
Sure.
And so this these end members push us quite widely, and so we have a broad span of what the possible outcomes are from the outcome of that. And now you might say, well, why only 5? What about my personal policy implementation? What, you know, I'd say we could do something and then that would tweak, maybe not as far as from one of these to the other one, but a little bit in one direction or the other. How do I think about that? Well, it's only 5 because for each of these, we were running around the world, about 4 dozen climate models are run on each of these. And then in addition to that, sometimes a few of those were selected for even further modeling studies. So in my chapter, we were examining ice sheet change and glacier change, which is an important part of sea level rise.
Yep.
And so about 4 dozen ice sheet models were run on top of each of those previous models. So it's many hundreds and hundreds of models that are put out there. So we can't consider all the possible scenarios. We just have to choose 5 as a decent number to start with.
Also a question about this, is there an overlap in some of these scenarios? So for example, what happens when regional rivalry and inequality and fossil fuel development take place together? Or does the SSP5 include all of the previous ones?
So no, it's they're each of them is quite distinct. So they have different really sort of philosophies between them. I mean, maybe within the middle of the roads at different warming levels, it might be sort of just a little turn the dial up, turn the dial down. But there are pretty substantial differences in where the population centers grow and where the land use changes, and then whether it's a methane-driven economy or whether it's a gasoline-driven economy. Those are the kinds of things that appear that differ among these estimations.
Sure.
And so the last point I wanted to make is that there's one really interesting thing that came about in the 6th assessment report for the first time, which is the use of something called an emulator, which is like a climate model, but it's a teeny tiny one that's very fast to simulate. But then it's machine learning is used to make them very accurate. So they only ask a few questions, but those questions, they can reproduce what the climate models would do. And so the nice thing about that is from the policy perspective, the use of those emulators means that now you can go back and examine all the other policy choices and see what might have occurred, because those emulators make it easy to revisit. We couldn't have built them without the first set of the few hundred climate models, the big
Sure.
ones, supercomputer ones. But once we have those, they help us interpret and go in between these scenarios and think more about what particular policy changes might do. So that's a new tool that now, or a relatively new tool that's being used more and more. And that's the kind of thing that at the last COP meeting, there was a presentation about that by Piers Forster and others that was talking, they called that democratizing climate science, because you don't need a supercomputer center to run an emulator. You don't need a national modeling center to do it. A single scientist anywhere in the world could take those and work together with policymakers to really understand what's going on. I think that's a very a promising kind of change in science, when those kind of tools can be built for wide use. So
no, I was about to ask you if a policymaker who's probably not a climate scientist can play around with the emulator and figure out some scenarios for themselves.
yes, there's one called Magic with 2 C's, MAGICC, and they actually have some web tools that you can play with. So even without understanding the equations or whatever, you can kind of get a better handle on what the different forcings do and how that model behaves and what goes in and what comes out. So that's a place that I would recommend people could start. If you just search for Magic with 2 C's, you'll find
Magic with 2 C's, is it?
You'll find that web page.
Awesome. Well, members in the audience, please take note of this. Let me go over to Dr. Schultz. Wendy, most policymakers, given limited time and resources, cannot conduct analysis that would come close to scientific rigor. Recently, you delivered a masterclass at the Association of Professional Futurists on tools and mindsets for describing and analyzing emergent systems. What are some of these mindsets that policymakers can adopt to make better policies concerning climate change? And if you could also talk a little bit more about this presentation that you made at the APF.
Sorry, and I have to apologize for a second. I was meant to share this, and my buffer had, wow, that's very interesting.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to share that. That's about something else.
That's okay.
But it is talking about evaluating foresight work. Actually, I'm very grateful to be the third speaker and follow these eminent researchers and scientists, without whose work I would not be able to do the work that I do, because I, in fact, spend a lot of time trying to help people think through the systemic interconnections of all the changes going on around us, and to consider what that might mean in terms of emergent possible futures, emergent possible contexts. So to think in an exploratory nature about change. So Professor Fox-Kemper, fantastic to hear that briefing. And that's why I was trying to share the actual link to magic.org. Let's try that again, because I plan on looking at it myself as soon as possible. And actually, it's a very nice segue to what I'd like to talk about that more specifically answers your question, Arpit, than the particular exercise that I did with the APF.
Sure.
Granted, that was a useful exercise in the sense that it was an introduction to thinking systemically about specific issues and to really consider all of their dimensions, especially as perceived from different communities and different stakeholders, different cultures, different locales, to get a group of people with very diverse perspectives into a room and say, what do we think about the current state of agricultural sustainability and how you get actually the food on your kitchen table and distribution mechanisms and how this all ties in with energy and fossil fuel use. And so to get people to think systemically and locally and interconnect that, and then after they kind of create a a mind map, a picture of what that looks like, then to start asking them to think through the changes they're seeing around them, the emerging, both the trends and the emerging novel changes that are surprises that are popping up around us, and ask the question, where do those changes land on the system map of this issue? And how do the impacts ripple out and affect you and your community or your business or your policy unit in ways that maybe you hadn't anticipated? So that's very much about exploratory thinking. And what is very useful about particularly the scenarios that Baylor just presented us is that they are exploratory. So they do ask people to think about a range of possible outcomes that are the result, the consequences of decisions that we're making, of how we're allocating resources to different projects or policies or programs or businesses or community efforts here in the present, and how that will ripple out, we hope, if we're making good decisions, to good effect in terms of ameliorating as much as possible the climate change that is already in train and inevitably going to occur to some extent, and maybe helping us adapt to living in what is inevitably going to be a very different world. So the fact that there are now, again, democratized, easily accessible options to play with rigorously scientifically based models is great. I'm going to bring it down to an even simpler level for introducing people who are really new to all of this. So obviously the kind of exercises that I do where I get people to explore both systems mapping of issues and to learn to heighten their awareness about emerging change and the impacts that could potentially have on our systems is one way to approach it. But specifically with regard to this issue, I have recently been working with two different projects that we are actually trying to knit together, one of which touches on what Baylor has been discussing, and the other is directly related to that issue that Professor Oppenheimer very cogently laid out about the supposed idea that targeted public funding will leverage or amplify private funding. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project called Deep Transitions Futures, which is meant to address some of the private funding decision-making. But with both, and one of the points that we had to wrestle with was, how do we very quickly bring a group of decision makers up to speed about understanding the complications and the intertwining systems of cause and effect, and sometimes emergent effects, not necessarily linear effects, that are what, at a very technical level, the climate change models try to portray or do portray. And so let me pull back a second and say there is a project. It's an NGO-driven project at this point, and it's built quite a global community, and perhaps you've even heard of it, called Climate Fresque or Climate Collage. And it's essentially a way of helping people who will not read the IPCC report in all its technicalities to understand the key points of the arguments that are being made and have a look at the data. And so essentially it's a workshop, and you can take anybody through it. And I don't know if either of you gentlemen have heard of it before. I'm going to share my screen briefly to show you. And again, this is meant to be an introduction at a basic level and a facilitated discussion for people whose main knowledge of climate change may be kind of what they're reading in the news or hearing about in the newspaper, or horribly seeing in social media and on Facebook. So let me share screen. So this is the Climate Fresque front page. But importantly, what the people who devised this did was they sat down with the IPCC report and they said, there's data in here and there are arguments in here that are very important for people to to see and to begin to understand. How can we make that easier? How can we make it more accessible? Kind of like democratizing the IPCC report, just as magic democratizes the climate models you're talking about. And what they basically did was they took a lot of the graphically displayed information in the IPCC and they chunked it up into cards and asked people, they deal out the cards and they say, tell us how you would arrange the causal connections between these cards. So this is, and they do it in several sets. So this is, oh, sorry. That's a bit of a, I hope I didn't give anyone motion sickness with that sudden zooming in and zooming out. So as you can see, they pull out various aspects of the data in that, starting with human activities as the base card, right? And people are just given the cards. They aren't given the connections. And so the idea is, you know, how would you map this out? How would you interconnect these sets of issues? Let's see if I can, sorry, this does not zoom easily. So this first set of cards is basically, you know, what are different human activities and what do they need, and what are some of the immediate impacts? And then you are dealt out another set of cards that maybe starts looking at more impacts, more fossil fuel use, more deforestation, changes to CO2 emissions, what all of you are familiar with from climate modeling. And it builds up the system of impacts on the planet and on human activities, and ends with, quite frankly, the rather dire outcomes of food chain collapse, droughts, famines, migration, war, conflict, etc. And again, each group ends up mapping it slightly differently, and the facilitator's job is to correct the logic if they make connections that aren't actually logically supported by the IPCC report. So with each set of cards, the group has a conversation about, well, how do you view this? Where does it fit in with your local community or your country? How does it relate to the local economy? And so it becomes a very rich discussion over about 3 hours. And again, each of the cards has, let's see if I can get it to flip. Each of the cards has information on both, the front and the back. So in 3 hours, you can have a workshop which gets people to understand both more about the actual data in the IPCC report, but more importantly, that involves them in mapping out those interconnections. And quite frankly, by the end of the 3 hours, most people are quite depressed. And my slight frustration with this is that, so they end by saying, well, what can you do about this? And unfortunately, at the individual level, yes, we should all be more mindful. Yes, we should all be recycling. Yes, we should all be using, conserving energy when we can. Yes, 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 all those things. All of our individual actions will not have enough impact. We need a significant transformation in the systems of the world, which leads to the other project. So if we get here, then the systemic question is, well, how do we change systems that are that huge, that have so much momentum and inertia, because they are systems that have been built up economically, physically, in terms of infrastructure, even in terms of our behavior and our attitudes over the past hundreds of years. And what that means is you need to change a lot of the rules of play of the world as we know it.
Yeah.
And the current power structures, and those I'm counting both political and economic power structures, obviously are invested in not changing the rules because they've succeeded by those rules. So the other project that I have been working on is something called Deep Transitions, and I truly am just a supporting facilitative and foresight contribution to this. It's an international team. It's being led by a group of scholars who worked on analyzing the patterns of historical change let's see how to put this, broad global change. So essentially the kinds of systemic global changes that were characterized by the shift from agricultural economy to the industrial economy, and then from the industrial economy to the digital economy. So the question is, how do we support a transformative deep transition that actually does get us to a sustainable future that is operating by very different running rules? And the first part of this was historical, but the second part is what links in to what Professor Oppenheimer was talking about. The second part of this, after the historical analysis and the sociology analysis of the actual patterns of change, systemic patterns of change that are observable in previous deep transitions, after that theory was built up and refined, they basically said, right, if we want to use this, if we want to actually apply this theory to make change in the world and global change, who are the people that have a lot of leverage in this situation?
Mhm.
And their answer was, well, at least one group of those people are the advisors and managers of very large investment funds, either actual sort of financial stockbroking funds, mutual funds, or national pension funds,
Sure.
national development funds. So what they did was assemble a panel of about 24 investors of these very large funds from all over the world. And then, speaking of democratizing things, and then we had to teach them deep transitions theory, which was kind of an interesting project. But the understanding that you develop there about the systemic interconnections between even things like sets of new emerging technologies that might singly provide some answer or some solution to a single part of one of our environmental problems or a single chunk of the climate situation become far more powerful when you start looking for inventions or new business models or paradigms, new ways of developing economies in communities that interlink. And so it all comes back to systems thinking, that interlink to create ecologies of change, that ecologies of new ways of doing things and new technologies that amplify each other and that really support seeing the world and how we do things differently.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go back to wearing my futurist hat for a second. And Baylor talked about different scenarios of possible outcomes that we all need to consider and get used to thinking about. From a futures point of view, those are truly scenarios. Scenarios are exploratory thought experiments about what could happen. And you use them for contingency planning, and you use them for developing arrays of what you hope will be more robust suggestions for solutions. But the other thing that we do as futurists is say to people, what future do you want? And so the Deep Transitions Futures Project, and this I'll just end with this, also created a set of futures, 3 desirable worlds that are desirable in the sense that they address and create transitions to a kind of a different system for living on the planet, but they do that in different ways, reflecting different value choices, different policy options. And what we then did was attempt to build some pathways looking at actual new innovations, new ways of doing things in the present, to see if we could build towards each of those 3 more desirable futures, but following slightly different paths, because different values all over the world, different policy needs, different locales. So that's part of what a combination of sort of futures thinking, of good historical analysis and understanding of the climate systems, and systems thinking can do in terms of helping policymakers.
That is super interesting, Wendy. In fact, the 3 scenarios and the pathways is something that I would be, and we as a group would be super interested in learning more about. So would really appreciate if you could also share these links in the chat box over here, and if we could read about that later. Let me come back to Professor Oppenheimer here with my question. My question is regarding your paper, A Physical Science Perspective on Disaster Through the Prism of Global Warming. In that paper, you emphasize the role of memory and learning in dealing with disasters. You share this example where there was a hurricane in 1992 at the Barrier Island in West Hampton Beach in New York, and houses and beachfront were lost to the sea. You observe that if you go back there today, today meaning when you wrote this paper, you'll notice that the Barrier Island has been reconstructed. Houses with similar vulnerability have been rebuilt with a 30-year guarantee from the federal government. You also share the example of 1965, when Hurricane Betsy struck the Gulf Coast and New Orleans, did not learn the lessons even after 40 years and paid the price for it. And I can relate it to what we see over here in India. For example, the similar loss of memory we can see in our various cities and states such as Odisha over here, which is southwestern India, and where every few years, if not every year, people who are living closer to the coastline lose their property, lose their lives because of flooding, because of hurricanes, etc. So what are some of the measures that you think may be taken to improve human memory, or at least policymakers' memories, or do you think that that's just a disability that is innate to us?
Yeah, well, it's a tough question because we're dealing with human nature. But let me first lay out this point before people, to keep people's minds on the relationship between what was just said by Wendy in particular, but also by Professor Fox Kemper, Baylor. We have a problem in our societies about where decisions should be made, are best made, and having that bear some relation to the set of decisions that are made at all different scales, whether they be international, national, regional, or very local. And in dealing with climate change, whether it's mitigation of emissions or adaptation to the impacts of climate change, you're dealing with a problem where the decisions made at one scale are often just very poorly coordinated with what's going on at another scale. And if you think about it, there's a point actually that Wendy made implicitly, and it's also, she made it explicitly, it's also implicit in Baylor's presentation, which is you have to figure out how these different layers of decision are related to each other, because no, except in the rarest of societies, no decision made at the highest level actually gets completely and effectively and efficiently implemented at the lowest level, and that's probably a good thing in many cases. And it's very hard to make decision making or intention at the smallest scale filter up so that those making decisions at the highest level understand those intentions, proclivities, desires, and then reshape their decision making accordingly. So how we get that mismatch better coordinated is, to my mind at least, one of the biggest problems if as we talk about the point Wendy made about the transformation of society as a whole. Now, getting back to the question of adaptation, where it really is a key issue as far as I'm concerned. One way to solve the adaptation problem or get governments and individuals focused on the best options it is essentially the democratic process of voting people out of office who aren't focused on them. And one of the problems with that is that adaptation is a long-term proposition. And politicians work on shorter time scales of 2 years, 4 years, however it is till the next time they're elected in office. And that's really, that timescale is not conducive to dealing with projects like building surge barriers or water delivery systems in response to climate change, or moving, relocating settlements, for instance, is another very tough one. Those are projects that have to be thought of and planned over decades. The people who plan those projects, who raise the finance for those projects, aren't the leaders, the political leaders, aren't the same people who are going to be around when those projects come to fruition and actually save lives, save property. So there's the things that politicians usually try to put before the public as something they've achieved is in some ways for them empty until it produces some results, which can be, in the case of climate adaptation, decades later. So that's the inherent problem from a political point of view. From the individual point of view, it's a matter of psychology. People have what's sometimes been framed as very high short-term discount rates. That is, they want to return on anything they're going to pay for quickly. But if you, for instance, own a home, you can make an improvement on it, for instance, to protect it from hurricanes. But that, hurricanes don't strike any one place except, certain places on the Bay of Bengal or Japan, parts of China, Philippines that do get hit repeatedly. In the United States or in Europe with hurricane force winds, it won't happen at any one place all that frequently. So there's time to forget. There's time for that tendency of humans to just not act on something that's right in front of them because there's always something more important. So those are the two gaps that we have to figure out a way to get around. And the best approach that I've heard of in institutionalizing climate adaptation to make it a key role for governments at all those levels is to create bureaucracies in the central governments and in the local governments for which it's a full-time responsibility, and dedicating a continuous stream of financing to projects that are key to adaptation, but which require long-term planning and finance. And such as the ones I mentioned before: relocation, surge barriers, water supply and distribution systems, and so forth. There's a very long list of them. And we have that in other sectors. We actually, in some countries, do very effective long-term planning on some aspects of society and lousy planning on others. And unfortunately, because climate adaptation needs to address a continually evolving risk, because climate risk is getting more severe all the time as the climate changes, at least until it stops changing. We've got, and we don't know when that's going to happen because it depends on our actions. We've got a situation where the risk is not only evolving, but it's very uncertain, as Baylor pointed out. So we have to get out of this mode of reacting to climate change as if it's reacting to a set of disasters, which are episodic, because the responses have to be long-term, thought out in advance. A lot of them are expensive, and they have to be continuous. And so the disaster model is just not enough. Of course, you have to have disaster planning, because no matter how effective your adaptation planning is, we're always going to fall short sometime or another, and you have to be prepared for disasters to occur. But it's been said in the social sciences of climate change that there is no such thing as a disaster on the physical science side. It's a social phenomenon due largely to the lack of planning, triggered by a physical thing, physical entity or phenomenon like a hurricane, for instance. So we need to stop from acting as if each extreme event is a one-off. They are not. But instead, in fact, they're going to be occurring more and more frequently. And eventually, in some aspects of climate change, like extreme heat at the lower latitudes, they become continuous. They're just there all the time, as formerly extreme events instead become the norm. We see this on the coast. We see this with heat waves. We eventually will see it in many different aspects of the climate problem. And the only meaningful way to deal with such a situation is continuous focus, continuous management of the risk. Now that's sort of a lot of that is I've spoke of so far is at the centralized government or national government level. But individuals, of course, also have an important role here. For instance, you know, what's the incentive to get individuals to give up their short-term focus and really think in the long term? And that's what the whole business of insurance is aimed at. It's aimed at getting essentially what we hope, but isn't always the case, relatively modest short-term contributions from individuals so that you have collective protection against a risk when it manifests because something bad happens. And there are ways to coordinate that. There are ways to get people to pay attention to reducing their own individual risk, to not let not wait until the government comes and does something, because there are some things the government is probably never going to do. Governments can make building codes to force people to build houses that are resistant to storms. But you know, actually enforcing those building codes is a sometime thing. Occasionally the governments do it, sometimes they don't. There are other incentives like rebates for if you purchase insurance, you get a rebate if the property you're responsible for is properly tuned to not be so vulnerable or exposed to high risk. So you get some money back on your insurance premium if you actually make an improvement in your property, which makes it less likely that you're going to actually have to collect off the insurance. So there are and that's one way to keep people's minds focused. But of course, the problem doesn't go away because somebody has to enforce the idea that you're actually going to purchase insurance. So, you know, making it cheaper through rebates is only one thing. You got to get people to buy in the first place and stay in. And so you have an enforcement problem, just like we have with the central governments and the idea that they're actually going to pony up contributions to other countries. So the problem doesn't go away, but it gets contained a little bit if you can get these mechanisms in place. So again, the key problem from my point of view is how you make the two scales, the larger scale, the intermediate scale, the multiple scales, the intermediate scales, the smaller scales at which individual or collective action occurs. How do you get them to coordinate so there's enough money from the higher scale, for instance, which has awesome taxing capability, to get the money to where the expenses are actually made, which often is at the local scale. And it's a particularly bad problem in federal systems like the one I'm experienced with, the US system.
Sure. Very quick follow-up questions on that. I also want to loop in Wendy's comment over here that, you know, in many cases, financial power brokers are essentially buying elections, and, you know, they don't really include they don't really back candidates who would take, you know, effective climate action. And that got me to also thinking that, you know, when you said that policymakers typically have, you know, a very short time horizon, and, you know, obviously we all realize that in democracies, but then by that logic, non-democracies, or probably non-democracies who are also environmentally conscious, perhaps UAE or Saudi, which, I mean, I don't know if we can explicitly call them environmentally conscious, but they tend to take a lot of actions on climate change mitigation, adaptation, etc. One could expect, would you say, more ambitious and more substantial projects being implemented in those regions? So that's question number one. And just to comment on the other thing that you said, I really think that the mindset of treating the climate issue as a permanent issue that needs to be dealt with is really important. But you also said that we need a permanent bureaucracy. In fact, after COVID, there was a lot of talk over here in India that we need a permanent bureaucracy of healthcare workers over here in India, or health administrators over here in India. And I remember getting into this debate with people that a lot of times, if you add to the bureaucracy, you add to more corruption, and you probably need to solve for that first before bringing in another bureaucratic layer. So just wanted to make that comment and ask you the question about the Middle Eastern countries.
So, it isn't just the Middle Eastern countries. China's been pointed to, on the mitigation side, being effective at getting things done. Well, I think that's an argument that doesn't hold water. There are examples of non-democratic countries being able to, through the brute force of government, be able to focus their attention on, not just environmental problems, and make things happen because they have power, essentially, that it is more diffuse in democratic societies. But I don't think it holds across the board. What happens when a country like that makes a mistake? There's no corrective. And
sure.
that's one of the values of a democratic society. And I, for instance, believe in liberal democracy as a central principle. And, if that has to be sacrificed to solve this climate problem, A, I don't believe the proposition. B, it's a world I don't want to live in, Frank. That's my own personal view. You had a second question, which now.
Oh, that was just a comment about the bureaucracy bit.
Oh, bureaucracy. Well, that's a problem we face all the time. By the way, many non-democratic countries are essentially either kleptocracies, so the problem is even worse there, or they're set up in a way to benefit a different set of elites than is the case in some democratic countries. And though that's a problem that maybe forcing ourselves to deal with the climate problem could help us resolve. It would be nice if dealing with climate change turned out to be a good example rather than a bad example of governance. But in which case, we're going to have to think about how you establish new governing structures in a way which minimizes these issues that distract from the efficiency and efficacy of bureaucratic structures. And that's too big a problem for me to solve right here. And it's probably too big a problem for me to solve at all. But yes, it's a worry. It has to be dealt with.
No, certainly reminds me of my thesis when I was at Cornell, when I wrote about civil service reforms, and the world did not change after that thesis was written. So yeah. All right. Now, coming back to Professor Fox-Kemper. So back to the report. Your report mentions that if global net negative CO2 emissions were to be achieved and be sustained, the global CO2-induced surface temperature increase would be gradually reversed. But other climate changes continue in their current direction for decades to millennia. In parentheses, you wrote that this observation was made on high statistical confidence. For instance, you added, it would take several centuries to millennia for global mean sea level to reverse course, even under large net negative CO2 emissions. Again, on basis of high statistical confidence. Does that mean that even if we achieve nearly impossible goal of net negative CO2 emissions, we, and especially small island nations, are still kind of doomed?
So this is an excellent question, and it really touches on a lot of the points that Michael was just making about different timescales and and also the pieces that Wendy was talking about before about emergent phenomena. So an emergent cultural change takes time to occur. And so, yes, in one part of this story is the emergent cultural change, which would need to take place before we could get to net zero or net negative emissions. And then after that, you still would want to adjust to all of the changing hazards and risks. And so doomed is a relative term. I don't think that we are doomed, and I definitely think that we can make things an awful lot worse for ourselves by postponing the date to which we get to a net negative, or by emitting a lot before we then turn around and go net negative. In both cases,
Sure.
that would put a big blob of heat into these very slow to respond parts of the Earth system. So when we go to net zero, we expect quite quickly that the atmosphere will equilibrate, the surface ocean will equilibrate, the clouds will equilibrate, and will actually stay at near that temperature level. That leveling off happens almost within a decade. At least some of the more recent studies have shown on net zero. But the deep ocean and the ice sheets are today still catching up with the past warming. And so even if we stopped everything today, they would still be evolving as that warm water sinks through the deep ocean and goes through all of the pathways. Now you might think, oh, well, you know, that's deep in the ocean. There's probably not even very much life down there, but deep ocean warmth means ocean expansion. And so the sea level rise aspect of that is still there. That slow change in the ice sheets also means additional sea level rise. And so sea level is sort of is one of the most characteristic examples of the slow to respond parts of the Earth system. And those are still catching up with what's already happened in the past and will be catching up for a long time to come afterward. But we certainly can make our job much harder. And so if I can share screen again, I pulled together a couple of results just to show some of the most important things. So we often talk about the amount of sea level rise at 2100 in meters above a present baseline, or 2150. And so for the lowest emission scenario that I just talked about, yes, it is still increasing between 2100 and 2050. These numbers are big in comparison to the sea level rise we've already experienced, about twice what we've already experienced, but they're nothing like the numbers on this end. So not only are the numbers on this end much bigger by 2100 and bigger still by 2150, but they're increasing faster. And so the most important thing I want to point out here is, so the present rate of sea level rise is about 3.5 millimeters per year. And if we were to stay on a low emissions future, or quickly get to a net zero or a net negative, we would stay at pretty much that rate until it slows down. It doesn't continue rising.
Okay.
Whereas if we go in a high emission scenario, it'll continue rising before it even starts coming back down. So there's a spike of a lot more sea level. And since it's the rate of sea level change that really sets the rate of adaptation that you must accomplish to stay where you are, or also the rate of retreat from coastal areas that are becoming uninhabitable, obviously the faster rates or increasing rates really drive problems for us. So I would say that the present rate that we have now is challenging, particularly in places in small island developing nations and developing states. That's absolutely a problem. The present issues we're dealing with we're slowly making adaptations along with that. I wouldn't call it doomed to say we continue adapting at that rate for a few centuries. What I would say is doomed is when we're on the other end, when we go through a very strong emission spike before reducing back, and then we not only have to deal with the present rate, but with increasing rates that result from that. So I think we're a long way away from doomed, even though there are substantial challenges, particularly for small island nations that are coming. And they're unavoidable in the sense of we can't stop them by just reducing emissions. We need other kinds of structures about adaptation and cost sharing and other aspects of other pieces of the story we've been talking about today.
So thank you so much. I think I got stuck. My internet got stuck for a bit. Please tell us that the 8.5 scenario is not super likely and we can sleep in peace.
Yes, that's the one that I said before, that energy policy folks don't think it's possible. And we also don't think it's sort of to understand what the high end looks like more than it is a realistic scenario. This, unfortunately, the same is probably also true of the 119 that I was showing. It's those middle columns that are probably the most important ones to pay attention to.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you so much for that. All right. So again, coming back to Professor Oppenheimer, again, going to the aforementioned paper that we were discussing, you said that the limitations of adaptation, citing the case of India building dams on River Ganga, which to divert water to the fast-flowing population of West Bengal, reduced the flow of the river into southwest Bangladesh, and that led to the salinization of rice fields there and the disruption of normal water cycles. Now, what sort of adaptation measures do you think work well under, when you're making such decisions? Or do you think that, adaptation in general has fundamental limitations, and, mitigation is all that we can do? We cannot probably uh, control all of the, negative externalities of adaptation.
Well, with the example you gave, the Farakka Barrage, it's called, I'm sure that India looked over at Bangladesh and just, made a decision where it traded its own welfare for Bangladesh's. And those are the kinds of things that happen in the real world. So country to country cooperation and adaptation is important. So at least each understands what the other is up to and why. And so you can minimize these kinds of conflicts. And it's necessary inside countries too. We have the same problem. You build a seawall in one place and it protects, for a while at least, one location, but it makes the situation worse in the neighboring locations which aren't protected. So this is a problem that just needs to be grappled with at any scale. But I think in the largest way, in the most effective way to conceive of the adaptation problem is that the things that work the best are the things that improve livelihoods and reduce vulnerability to climate change across the board. That is, they are things that reduce vulnerability in general, of which climate change vulnerability is only one aspect. And the way you do that is work to improve the livelihoods of those who are least able to protect themselves in our societies. And that's, of course, what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. And it's arguable as to whether much progress has been made on them. There's a lot of talk about it this week. And, we have to focus on that larger picture while we're also focusing on the more focused issue of specific adaptation to specific climate threats. The reality is we're never going to be able to spend enough money in particular countries, or in any country for that matter, to fully protect against the climate changes that are already in the bank, that are going to happen. But we are also, at the same time, we have to remember, most countries have a goal of improving the livelihoods of their own people, and improving livelihoods can be done in a way, and in general, does reduce vulnerability to climate, to COVID, to a number of things.
Everything, yeah.
So I think that's really, I don't want to waste a lot of time talking about a million different messages. That's the big one as far as I'm concerned. If we attend to improving the lot of humanity in general, particularly the part of humanity that can't help itself all that much in the face of climate change, we will, without any question, improve their ability to reduce their own risk when they confront climate change.
Which also means that it is not, as it is popularly posed, it is not always a competing set of priorities of improving livelihoods and making places climate resilient. And I think that's a message, and it probably also does not need brain-racking innovations to think about some of those methods. And that's, I think, the message for policymakers, really, that those solutions are not the most difficult solutions, and not.
Yeah, that's right, and it's kind of a scoundrel's answer to anybody who tries to do anything on climate change, whether it's mitigation or adaptation. Well, there are trade-offs in the world. Of course, there are trade-offs in the world at the large scale, but particular expenditures on climate change don't necessarily come out of some other particular pot of something you want to see done. And anyway, a lot of the things that need to be done to improve resilience against climate risk, but also to reduce emissions, are wise things to do from a variety of points of view. And the whole point of it is to reset the human adventure so that we're doing all this stuff that needs to be done anyway, more coherently and in a way that reduces the climate risk.
Absolutely. Well, last question over here to Dr. Schultz. What do you think is the role of technology in tackling climate change and making policies for the future?
What a great question. And bear with me, because I'm going to come at it a little obliquely, because I want to tie together some of the really interesting threads that have emerged out of this. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. What a fascinating conversation for what is turning into a rainy Saturday afternoon here in Oxford. I want to connect back to memory and learning, and the idea that as humans, we encode memory and we sense, make, and learn through storytelling, telling ourselves stories about things, creating narratives. And as a futures researcher, one of the pieces of data in which I'm most interested are the stories people tell about what the future might be and what their own individual futures might be. And one of the difficulties, again, with this problem is how difficult some of those stories can be to shift. And I have some personal experience of this. I mean, I literally have been working in working climate change related issues into the futures work I've been doing since the mid-1980s, when in fact, as a grad student, one of the first projects I worked on looked at global climate change and sea level rise in the Marshall Islands. And that was famously, it was around that time that the now defunct Pacific Islands Monthly magazine put out an issue with a completely black cover, and in bright yellow, it just said, "Say goodbye to Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands." And it listed most of the Pacific Island atoll nations, because even kind of in Professor Fox Kemper's sort of middle of the road columns, the atoll nations are going to suffer extremely. I mean, they probably are doomed. So, or at least they are doomed to become a new climate nomads, right?
Sure.
And so, you know, that story was out in 1985. They were, though their national leaders were sharing that narrative of this is our potential future in international forums, you know, at the time. James Burke, a great sort of historian and commentator on technological change, actually, after doing his fantastic series Connections about how technological progress isn't nearly as linear and neat and tidy as we think of it, but is in fact messy and tangential and emergent, did a short, I think it's about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours total, video called After the Warming, which talked a lot about all of these issues. And again, that was in the 80s, and focused on the potential impact on the planet of the slowdown of the Great Atlantic Conveyor Current, right? And so these stories have been out there, and it is so hard to shift the public narrative. And what it reminds me is a great kind of apocryphal story in future studies about people's images of the future, and that question of scale. And how would we think about, well, even if we understand and have stories that explain to us what is going on at the national level or the global level, we keep them distant. And every time we talk about all of these changes in institutional terms, we're doing that. We're helping keep those narratives distant, because a set of educational futurists asked some, you know, like 6th graders,
Sure.
so what do you think some futures of the world are? And this was in the 60s, so the Cold War, right? And these were American school kids. Oh, well, you know, nuclear disaster, they painted pictures of mushroom clouds, and you just, the world is just going to be, it's the zombie apocalypse. Everything will be glowing green. And then a week later, they said, okay, so we're, thinking about futures, and when you imagine your future when you're grown up, what does it look like? And I swear to God, all the pictures were 2 cars in a nice suburban home with a picket fence and, family and a dog. And the teachers went, and last week, nuclear apocalypse. So what? And we do that. I do that myself. I know full well what the likelihood is of extreme catastrophic storms, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion in the water tables of coastal communities, all of that stuff, increased subsidence. Where are, the places that I'm potentially retiring to? Yes. Jacksonville Beach, Florida, and, Ka'ava, Hawaii. And I look at that and I go, well, how am I not, I've known this stuff for 40 years. Why didn't I work that one out better? So this notion of narrative transformations and connecting all the narratives at the scale from the very personal, so that we start recognizing what it's going to mean to us personally to live in the kind of transformed world that we will have to start creating, where, yeah, we all do take some form of mass transit and don't own cars. That's not just switching to EVs. It's, so what if you give up cars? So this question of how we are understanding this and digesting it and thinking through the kinds of changes we need to make is important. And your question about technology ties right into that. Because one thing that we see a lot in futures, especially in future studies, futures work in the United States and forecasting and scenarios, is the United States is by definition a pioneer culture. Mm-hmm. So for everyone in this group, and you were from all over the world, I want you to think about how your culture, how your sort of local, what your local myths are about how people adapt to change. And, do they adapt to change by just acknowledging it and literally adapting to it? Or do they push against it and create some sort of solution so that they don't have to deal with it? Because that's kind of the American culture, the pioneer myth of we'll just cut down the trees and turn the grassland into, farms and create dust bowls, which leads to the other problem. So yes, there are a lot of, we're a very innovative species. So that's kind of one of the cool things about humans. We do create amazing technological solutions. In the past, we have rarely done so with the proviso of really comprehensive thinking about the impacts and the consequences in a widespread way of the technologies we are inventing, disseminating, and proposing get used, in this case, potentially on a planet-wide scale. So the issue for me is that, yes, there are some interesting technological innovations, or as I mentioned with deep transitions, potentially ecologies of innovations or innovative new paradigms or models of doing things that could work together in interesting ways. But before we get too excited about implementing them, we have to have, and again, this gets back to where I started off with doing systems maps with everybody represented in the room. So we have to have conversations about the systemic impacts so that we can be accountable and responsible for the technologies that we are devising that might, in fact, provide some solution or help us adapt or help us ameliorate some of the impacts, and make sure that if there are people who are, it needs to be a just transition. Yep. So the focus needs to be on equality as well. And if there are people who are going to disproportionately bear some sort of cost or impact of a technology that would in fact help solve things, then we need to figure out how to compensate them, or in some way, make that situation better. So technological solutions do have the potential to offer hope if they're considered systemically, if we think about impact and consequence accountability, if diverse perspectives, and I'm not talking just about diversity of human perspective, but if in some classic facilitation terms, if we make sure that there is someone there who speaks for wolf, or who speaks for tree, or who speaks for river. And interestingly, there have been some initiatives lately to build rights for natural systems into constitutions. So that's politically, that's a whole interesting emerging technology. So people and the planet need to be strongly voiced and represented. And yes, I have another interesting little project I can send you to. The Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project, which rather than looking at sort of giant, it's funny, one of the deep transitions desirable worlds is called Earthshot, because we had to include the various financial perspectives of people who were saying, well, can't we just have some big technology that will like vacuum up the CO2? It's like, well, it is conceivable, but anyway, but
trees.
yeah, really, rather than thinking in terms necessarily of or wholly of big technology responses, what Good Anthropocenes does, this project, is basically say all over the world at a more local level, locally contextualized, people are looking at some of the issues and trying to think through how they can reduce the footprint, so contribute to net zero, and also think through how they might have to adapt to what may well be, at least for their lifetimes, permanently changed conditions. And let's all collect some of those pilot projects and see what works and what works where and in what context. And that's what the Seeds for the Good Anthropocenes database basically does. It's a globally crowdsourced database of here are good things that are, we're seeing happening around us. And there's been some very interesting work coming out of that, of doing, again, visioning of pathways to a net zero, or at least more ecologically benign set of lifestyles, way of producing goods and services and things, based on thinking through what it would look like if some of those pilot projects actually were kind of expanded to be more widespread. So I'll stop there, but yes, we have to think through consequences before we get too excited about exciting new innovations.
No, absolutely. I think, that sort of an inclusive approach would be, and a more deliberate and thoughtful sort of an approach would be, perhaps more sustainable. But with that, I already realized that we are about 13 minutes over time. So I thank all of the panelists for sharing these really, really interesting ideas, which has given us a lot of food for thought. And if some projects come out of this, we will be sure to inform you and let you know that, hey, we discussed this in 2022, and this is what we've made out of this. So I am indeed looking forward to that. But again, a big thank you from NWPOL and from the GPOTS Fellowship. And thank you for inaugurating our New York Climate Week event. We have another one where we are going to be joined by young researchers talking about innovative practices in climate change. And for those who want to stay back, please do tune in for that session, which we're going to start in another 10 minutes. But again, Professor Oppenheimer, Professor Fox-Kemper, and Dr. Schultz, thank you so much for joining us. It was indeed a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will take a 10-minute to our... Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to our second segment of a New York Climate Week event. And this is an event, this is going to be a very interesting panel discussions where young professionals who are our global policy, diplomacy, and sustainability fellows who are also going to be graduating today. Their graduation ceremony starts at around 8:30 p.m. India time. So right out of this panel, they are going to be discussing about issues around innovations in climate change policy. And we have four really bright, experienced fellows with us over here. We have Aishwarya Kandasamy, we have Dr. Purvi Zaveri, Anshika Katara, and we have IPSA over here with us. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this panel. I would first invite you to introduce yourself to all of the members in the audience, and then we jump straight into our questions and answers. So let me bring in Aishwarya over here first. Aishwarya, if you could introduce yourself.
Definitely. Thank you, Arpit. Hello, everyone. This is Aishwarya Kandasamy. I am associate at Pravda Associates, a law firm based in Chennai. Yes, that is all about me. And I'm also working on some interesting national and international projects. It's fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aishwarya. And let me invite Purvi to introduce herself, please.
Hey, hi. Thank you, Arpit. And thank you, GPODS, for inviting us to this event. It is an honor to be part of panel and discussing something from the youth side. So about me, I did my PhD in microbiology from Nirma University. I am been interested into ecological economics, and GPOD has given me a transition from being completely into technical to the circular economy field. So thank you, and I look forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Purvi. And let me bring in IPSA over here. IPSA, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Arpit. Yeah, my name is IPSA. I am currently a graduate student at the London School of Economics, studying Masters in Public Administration. And before this, I used to work back in New Delhi on sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people. Yeah, and I'm very happy to be here. Also very happy to hear all of our introductions change over the course of this.
I know.
Aishwarya has gone from being a student to a working professional. For me, it has been the other way around, and Purvi can now say that she's a circular economy specialist, which is great.
Well, that's what GPODS is all about. We don't let you be the same.
So yeah, excited for that transformation and excited to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, IPSA. And let me also invite now Anshika to introduce herself, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anshika. I'm an engineering graduate and a development studies graduate. Currently, I'm working as a political consultant in one of the organizations. So yeah, even I have changed from working in an NGO from quite some time to right now working in a political consultancy, which I was really wanting to work and experience how the politics in India happens. So yeah, very excited and very grateful to be part of it.
Super interesting. And you should share more about how your view of things might have transformed working on the political side of things as well. Okay, so this particular panel, we're going to be dealing with extremely practical issues, extremely issues which are close to our home, and the challenges that we can almost touch and feel on a daily basis. I remember yesterday when I was coming back from my hometown, Firozabad, it was raining cats and dogs over here. I literally saw cars being submerged into all of the flooding that happened in the city. And there's no greater evidence right at your doorstep that extreme weather events are here and they are here to stay. I would really encourage the audience members whenever they want to raise their hands and ask questions to our panelists over here. So unlike the previous discussion, this one is probably going to be a little more laid back and a little more, conversational from the perspective of interaction with the audience. But with that, let me first, bring in Aishwarya to answer my first question, which is, and I'm going to pose the same question to all of our friends in the panel over here, which is that what, in your opinion, are the top 2 to 3 policies or policy ideas that have had a positive impact on climate change? Since, we are also looking at solutions in this particular panel discussion, not just focusing on problems. Let's start with, what are, some of the more successful policies that you think would have a great impact or have had a great impact?
Thank you, Arpit. So I have 3 in mind. The first one is the celebrated and one of the most successful international environmental treaty, that is the Montreal Protocol, because we have never managed to reverse, a climate chaos, but we managed to not just reduce, freeze, but also, reverse the ozone depletion. I think that is something historic and
That's
inspiring.
an achievement, yeah.
But Anshika is going to deal in detail about that.
Okay.
So my other 2 policies that I came up with is that, since you also posed this question to Dr. Oppenheimer, this is Netherlands climate adaptive city planning or infrastructure planning, because Netherlands is prone to flooding, and they still remember the 1953 great floods as something, that shook their nation. So that is when it took them 40 years of planning, and they constructed around 34 projects, which costed them around 3 billions, to ensure that, which also includes the strategic planning of intentional flooding of certain parts of the nation to save their cities during the time of flooding. And through this infrastructure management, they also have achieved that the Dutch rivers can have absorption rate, which is 25% more than what it was previously.
So they would do the intentional flooding just to test whether the system is resilient?
Not test, they have been following this intentional flooding for the past few years.
Interesting.
Yes. So when we say climate adoption, and Dutch is already, pioneering in their infrastructure planning. So this is something other nations should also look up to. But it is that is very peculiar to the structure of the Netherlands and their geography. But I think still we can, drew inspiration from them. And the second thing is China's Red Line project, which is climate change is not just about decarbonization, right? We have literally every SDG is synergic to climate change. So it is also essential to protect the biodiversity that we already have, because they themselves, in a way, act as carbon sinks. So China's Red Line project is basically fixing red lines to stay green. This project was initiated in 2011, and in 2022, according to the reports available, China has a 30% of their forest cover, which is protected under their Red Line scheme. Again, one of the challenges whenever we come in with
a red line is basically a protected area, is it?
Yes, protected area of forest.
Okay.
So this will ensure that the biodiversity targets which were enshrined in the international articles is also met, along with not promoting irrational development.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, all nations have the scheme, but having a clear target like China would be much more beneficial, is what I feel. So these are something to.
And would you know that, because I also somehow have a sense that in India we have reserved areas.
Yes.
How would that compare to what you have over here in China? Because I think that the Indian reserved areas, some of them are pretty successful.
Thank you. I think that should be addressed when I was talking about China. We have reserved forest, protected area, and there are lots of classification under Indian legislation. The thing is, when it comes to our legislation at least, we have exceptions to almost all these reserved forest thing. We can, the 2021 Biodiversity Protection, amendment bill ensures that the medical plants need no government approval to be, utilized, which is something that might endanger the medical species itself, because we won't know if it comes from a protected forest or a regular forest, or it is simply cultivated. And we have lots of exception
to various legislation.
Yes, that is provided when it comes to.
But do we know if those exceptions don't exist in the Chinese legislation?
Yeah, this was one of the challenges that I was saying. China does have exception, but they have a much stricter implementation of this red line scheme too. Yes, that is why.
Got it. No, super interesting, and I think all three examples are interesting to look at. The Montreal Protocol, the Netherlands river systems, and the red lines in China. Thank you so much, Aishwarya. Let me go over to Purvi and pose the same question. What do you think have been policies or initiatives that have so far had the greatest impact from a climate preservation perspective? Over to you, Purvi.
Thank you, Arpit. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So when we were discussing about the question, and the thing that I want to talk about today is the Ramsar Convention. And according to me, Ramsar Convention is something which I consider as a milestone, not just because I come from the biology background or biodiversity background. It was Dr. Luke Hoffman in 1962 who initiated the whole concept about conservation of the wetland. And it started because the migratory birds were not finding places to stay and live and propagate. And so that's how this whole thing started. That was a research that was going on. And why the name is because the convention or the conference happened in the Ramsar city of Israel. So that's why it's named as Ramsar Convention. The whole thing has, the title goes as conservation of wetlands and internationally important water flow habitats. So it was more of according to me, this is the most evolved convention that I could go through while studying. Sure. It has 12 articles, and it is approved by UNESCO. And so the whole structure of the convention was to it's the smallest convention probably written. It's a 3-page convention with 12 articles.
Oh, really?
And yes, and it's absolutely clear. I mean, they have defined what are wetlands, what are they talking about, what is marshland, and why it is ecologically important. It is all included in the whole segment. And then they go and list the responsibility of the parties who would be involved or who would want to be the parties who are contracting into the convention. So this was the most clear message that they were giving, that we need to conserve the whole ecosystem, and not just because it has ecological importance, but it also has a lot of, it has a potential to affect the climate change. So it was back in 1962 where they had realized it. The whole convention, the defining of whole thing went for a decade. And in 1975 is when they actually came up with the whole document. And it was agreed by first 18 countries, just 18 countries. And in 1974, Australia was the first one to declare a Ramsar wetland site. So that was the first country to enter the convention. And onwards from COP1, so it was in 1984, 28 countries, and it kept on logarithmically increasing. And what we have right now is 170 countries. So if a convention or a policy is to reach a success ratio of something, then this is a participation that I see. And so because it also mentions that it is a soft law. It is not literally binding, but not binding. So it says that, yes, you have to declare a site and you have to protect it. But it doesn't mention how you would protect it. So governments are given liberty.
Does it mention how big the site needs to be?
Sorry?
Does it mention how large the site needs to be?
Yeah, so the first convention doesn't, I mean, the first document doesn't have a specification, but it went through, as I said, it's the most evolved thing. So over a period of time, they have had multiple document release. And now they're mentioning some of the species identification that you should have, some of the, uprooted species is required. And now there are more specification than what it was back then. And it also makes sense in my head because recently in our country, there's a bullet train project between Gujarat and Mumbai going on. And there's a rebellion community who have come up because there's a marshland which is to be evacuated and cleared up for the track. So that made the more sense for me to come up with the Ramsar Site Convention today.
And I'm assuming India is a signatory to this convention, is it?
We are part, we entered into the convention and we have 49 sites by now.
Oh, okay.
We have declared 49 sites, Ramsar sites by now. Overall, globally, we have, I mean, the registered sites are 2323. So 2023 sites are wetland Ramsar declared sites, and it covers 248 million hectare marshlands. Overall, it says that you have to use wisely. So wetlands have to be used wisely. And so that has been declared that you cannot have commercial activities in it. So it is a binding, but you can have some tourism. So, it gives a little liberty and a little bit of constraint. So in my opinion, it becomes the most convenient.
I think it touches that sweet spot.
Yes, it touches that sweet spot. So, and then they declared 2nd February as the Wetlands Day. So according to me, what Luke Hoffman started was it has reached a level where it's globally accepted by 170 countries. And more often to that, it's been 2 decades or more than that, probably, that the convention was built. And the whole document is being incorporated by various countries as part of their own policies. So for India, if it's a wetland conservation policy, then we still refer to Ramsar Convention.
Okay.
So it's not directly a policy which contributes. I mean, I can say that's a policy, but it has been adopted by nations to prevent the loss and degradation of the wetlands. So that's why the migratory birds could be better conserved. So that was the one thing that I wanted to talk out loud rather than talking about 2 or 3. So that's where I am.
No,
Thank you.
This is brilliant, and I can already say that I'm learning so much from this discussion. What I really like about what you said in the Ramsar Convention is that things are super well defined, and well defined in a manner that you can just go and verify, and you can easily check whether a particular convention or a particular site as per the convention is there or is not there, and whether it meets all of the parameters. So I think that's
and they have to,
evidence-based thing is very, very.
Yes. And a country has to report the inventory, what all activities has been done. So, it's a tool given to the local government that if somebody is not following, then you can just report it. So it's more of a monitoring tool, but it makes sense to have a continuous improvement in the number of sites and preserve them as they were, let's say, 10 years back.
Interesting. I also think, and of course, it'll need more research to establish, but my intuition is that perhaps, keeping it somewhere in the gray area of being, a law and just, recommendations, that is sort of a good idea, and keeping some activities open and loud and the others restricted is also probably a good balance that it strikes. So thank you so much for bringing this policy which has had an impact to our notice, Purvi. Let me move over to IPSA and pose the same question over to you, IPSA.
Yeah, this is one of the rather difficult questions to think about and answer because assessing policies is complicated. But maybe I can try to break down what makes a good policy, and how do we think about what is effective, and then give examples of each. I want to preface this by saying that I did not think that there's any policy in the world currently comprehensive enough and yet effective enough to properly address climate change, because it's a very systemic problem.
Sure.
But if we think about it in terms of what is a good policy, right? I think firstly, I want to start by the Kyoto Protocol. Because even though it was very simple and it was very maybe rudimentary, it had one ask, and it was very simple, that countries have to reduce their CO2 emissions, right? Even it didn't even go as far as to say greenhouse gas emissions. It was just one
CO2
kind of target. And I think that part of its success could have also been because of that it was just very simple ask. And then it was easy to kind of get consensus on that, and then get things going and monitor it and, have it done. The second one, but at the same time, if you run the risk of oversimplification, right? And there is,
of course,
it is complex and diverse, and there needs to be nuance. So the second, this is not a policy, but this is a principle that I want to talk about, which is the principle of common and differentiated responsibility, which kind of came in one of the founding sort of conferences of the UNFCCC. And that the fact that principle was acknowledged, that nations have had historically varying trajectories of development, and that will impact the future, and their culpability into the problem, and also their capacity to address the problem. I think that was very important, and is a principle that we are still sort of going forward with, although it has been difficult to implement, which that is a question of larger intergovernmental cooperation and things like that. But if we think about common but differentiated responsibility, essentially it's talking about inequality, right? And so that brings me to my third example, which is probably the most concrete of these three, and yet has not been implemented yet, so we don't know what its implications will be. But the Green New Deal that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has introduced in the US, or is trying to push for, I think in terms of at least on paper, I appreciate the way that policy has been drafted, because first of all, it understands the assumption that the risks of climate change are different depending on the economic inequality that exists within a country in their case. And it kind of preempts some of those issues and tries to solve for it while talking in the policy itself. And another reason why I know all of this is because there's very good conversation that she does with people through multiple channels, most importantly her social media, where she democratizes this information and breaks it down, as Dr. Schultz was saying, is very important, right? And so they have thought about some of the issues where, and we have heard experts say this in our GPOTS fellowship, that some solutions to climate change are very important and sound great on paper, and those are ethically the right thing to do in terms of the climate lens. But you need to understand what is the human implication of that, especially to poor and marginalized people who may be relying on unsustainable means just for survival. And so I think it tries to kind of address that in a little bit by thinking about progressive taxation and reducing inequality.
Also, I think relates to something that Professor Oppenheimer talked about, that, if you, there are a lot of policies, and they're not hard to find, that can balance and take together the agenda of climate resilience as well as improving people's livelihood. And perhaps the Green New Deal could be that.
Perhaps. I mean, it still has many gaps in terms of how this will become feasible in a capitalist world, and especially a capitalist democracy like the US. So we'll only know when it's implemented, but in terms of its intent and its foresight, I think that probably is a good, well-drafted policy.
No, certainly. Perhaps we'll know when Cuba implements it. So, no, kidding over there. Okay, so let me come to Anshika. Anshika, if you're there with us, if I could pose the same question to you. I know that you're going to touch upon Montreal, and if there are other examples as well, but please do tell us about your thoughts on what have been the policies or initiatives or conventions that you think have had the greatest impact in building climate resilience until now.
So, Arpit, I would actually like to begin with, while I was researching and reading about it, I read Indira Gandhi's speech in the Stockholm Convention, where she was like the
famous speech.
She was the only one person to be present there. And she had told that how we need to maintain a balance between the environment and the development. And that that convention, I also want to touch upon that convention since I spoke about it, was the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. We have been polluting the environment so much and using such bad resources that it then came to the point that it might harm human health a lot. And so the countries across the world came together, and even today there are only 181 countries who have ratified it and have agreed to stop using those pollutants because they are going to harm the environment so much. So that was first thing. And then now going to Montreal Protocol, which I was
where Indira Gandhi, if I may just add, very famously said that isn't poverty the greatest pollutant of all?
Yes.
I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was something like that.
Yeah, she did touch upon that a lot, and she insisted that you cannot leave the poor behind. You need to take them, and your development cannot be just focused on the upper class or the it has to take the poor. Absolutely. And you cannot put the burden on the poor developing countries as well for a lot of things.
So again, sort of balancing equity with climate resilience.
Yes. So now the second thing, the Montreal Protocol, I wanted to touch upon that because it's one of the example of a successful policy which the world over, we have been able to actually see the results in our lifetime. It was around 1970s when the climate scientists started saying that, you know, the ozone layer is being polluted. It's been so depleted that the UV rays will start touching us and the problems would increase, the humanity would be in danger. And it's only by 1985 that the countries actually then started coming together, discussing, and the Montreal Protocol came into force. But it still took them 2 years. By 1987, many countries started coming on board it. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult for the developing countries because they were then relying too much on chlorofluorocarbons. So the principle of equal but a differentiated responsibilities worked very well. Today, we have been reading that the ozone layer is going to heal, is on the level of healing. And we have been successful to show how if all the countries across the world, developing countries and the developed countries come together, we will be able to make sure that the climate change, if not reversible, is at least contained. So that's why Montreal Protocol, according to me, is like one of the best protocols.
And this also had a lot to do with CFC emissions, right?
Yes. And one more convention, which I think in the passing I would like to talk about was CITES Convention, wherein we spoke about the endangered species. We also told that the countries across the world were told we should stop indulging in trade of these species because they are equally important. Biodiversity, we need to stop.
But how successful was that, do you think? Because
it's not
we
really
still have
successful.
So many species going extinct because of human trading.
Because it's not been very successful, but at least on the back of the mind of the countries, many countries had criminalized it. In India, it is a and in other countries also are trying to do it, but it's not been very successful because again, it's who actually engages in this.
But perhaps what we could say is that in the absence of those conventions, we would not have those laws which criminalize such trade, and we may have been in a much worse situation.
Yes, we might be in a much worse situation, or we might also might have lost them. At least now we are keeping track of these species, and so we have some idea of what's happening. So I think that's a step in good direction. I mean, I would like to end by saying that, yes, I agree with Ipsa that all the policies, none of them have been extremely successful, but at least without them, as you said, we would have been much worse off. So things have been much better than it could have been.
No, thank you. Could you tell us again the name of this convention which banned the trade of extinct or endangered species?
CITES, Convention of International. One second, I keep forgetting the full forms. I'm so bad at it. So
you can probably post it in the chat box
yes,
as soon as you find it.
Yes.
All right.
Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry. I had just made a note of it.
No. That's absolutely fine. Thank you, Anshika. All right. So let me pose a new question to the group over here, which is that, okay, we talked about the policies or the initiatives or the events or the ideas that have had the most impact on climate resilience until now. Okay. What are some of the policies that you think, and when I say policies, I'm including ideas or initiatives, everything. What are some of those which you think would have the most impact going ahead in the future? Because what we need to understand and appreciate as well is that, when the global systems evolve and the reality changes, what worked then may not work in the future. It may or may not. So if I were to take, let's say, a horizon of 2050, so what do you think are some of the things that you're most hopeful about in possessing a potential to make a positive impact? Ishwarya, if I could come first to you.
Sure. This is a really interesting question, and I have like few ideas that I was able to really, bet my money or yeah. So the first thing is, since Purvi touched upon the wetland conservation and Ramsar convention, I'm going to begin with my the initiatives that is going on towards the protection of mangrove forest. This is the same field which I worked on for my capstone project too.
Okay.
When we say climate resilience, I think one of the most naturally climate resilient species are mangroves. There are just to give a small idea as to what mangroves exactly are. These are species like plants, shrubs, or sometimes trees, which basically thrive in brackish water near the coastal areas of rivers or sea. And some mangroves are also protected Ramsar sites. We have a protected mangrove forest in India that are also tagged as Ramsar sites. The thing is, due to human activities, their infrastructure development or aquaculture, around 40% of mangroves that existed in the world was it just vanished away. But recently, the UN has been really focusing for the past decade, the focus on mangrove conservation and their biological significance, biodiversity and ecological significance is being appreciated because they are one of the best carbon sinks. And the recent studies show that mangroves can absorb more carbon than even Amazon rainforest. Compare it to 1 hectare of mangrove and 1 hectare of Amazon rainforest. Mangrove is an effective carbon sink. Yes. And at the same time, the destruction of the same means that you're, producing more carbon. You're releasing more carbon from the sink to the atmosphere. That's why the conservation of mangrove is also very important. And I also added like their biological significance is to that extent that there are
You meant the release of oxygen, right?
no release of carbon. Mangroves are carbon sinks. They store the carbon
Yes.
in the soil, and when mangrove gets destroyed,
Oh, then that
yeah,
results in, okay, sure.
they are so significant that like around 40 to 50 species are found only in mangrove forest.
Interesting.
But the more interesting part is that the mangroves don't even cover 1% of the land stretch in the world. Yeah, that is their significance, and they contribute greatly to the economy, to the blue economy. So there are initiatives that are going around the world, like the initiative by it's the best initiative that I came across with the protection of mangroves. That is One Blue Forest Initiative. It actually happens in Kenya, Gazi Bay of Kenya. It's also locally called Mikoko Pamoja initiative, where they don't just focus on conserving the mangroves that exist, but also have initiated. This is the first initiative which links mangrove conservation to the global carbon market. So
interesting. So there's a market angle to it as well.
Yes, and this initiative,
which is that you can trade carbon credits through those things, is it?
Yes.
Interesting.
And this initiative has also been, immediately emulated and adopted by different nations like Mozambique, and many other nations. So I think this focusing on mangrove is something, that is going to like have a huge, contribution to improving the climate resilience of mankind, because they also reduce the force of storm surges, tidal waves, etc. So the second initiative is, it is not something that is looked into very much, but I personally feel that looking into the knowledge and techniques by indigenous people, they are, for example, very recently, that is in the Paris Convention 2015, the local communities and indigenous people were like recognized at an international platform with connection to climate change. And we already had an ILO convention on indigenous and tribal people, but it doesn't, focus too much into their the aspect of climate change. But the thing is, like, they have when we talk about us, it's we are at the center of everything, right? But when it comes to indigenous people, they don't just focus on their livelihood, but also their livelihood is hugely
got an
dependent on their
ecological
environment.
perspective over there, not an anthropocentric but an ecocentric sort of perspective.
Yeah, because their livelihood is dependent on the environment around them, and it has been noted by many scholars and researchers that by observing the way the birds, the migration of birds happens, they change, diversify the crop varieties. They change their living areas so as to ensure the movement of other animals. They change the pattern of hunting and gathering. So these are, practices which can be studied and, if possible, followed, made into policies.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think this has a scope in future to, if we are going to talk about 2050 or 60, when we talk about mitigation and increasing the adaptation measures, then we should actually look into communities that are very adaptable to climate change.
Absolutely. What I'm liking about this panel is that we are actually diving deep into some of the solutions, which is rare for climate resilience panels, because a lot of time goes in just discussing the infinite problems. So really interesting over there, and I think that this also opens a very extensive and interesting research area for the researchers who are here in the room, that can we study some of the encoded knowledge that has been passed from generation to generation and developed in indigenous communities to sort of if I may use the term, mainstream them and scale them up for the greater benefit of humankind. So that is a really, really amazing idea. Just one final question about the mangroves bit. You said that there are a lot of preservation initiatives that are going on. Is it also possible to replenish lost mangrove areas? Or is it something that, once they're lost, you cannot really do much about it?
We can very well actually cultivate mangroves, but it has been also proven in studies that when we try to artificially, produce seedlings from the seeds of mangroves and try to cultivate it in the coastal areas, it's not very successful. The success rate is very less, which costs us billions. That's why we have this system of ecological mangrove reproduction is being proposed.
Okay.
Because once a mangrove tree or shrub is dead, the seedlings will be floating around that dead bark. And within 10 days, at most 10 days, these seedling will get rooted and will start growing at a normal pace. Yeah.
Interesting.
But
no, that's a fascinating and very useful area of research and policy action. Again, I mean, if coastal areas could just work on, if this could be the top priority of some of the coastal areas, it would have a really high payoff going on in the future. Thank you so much, Aishwarya. Let me go over to Purvi. And Purvi, if you could discuss again the same question, that what, in your opinion, are some of the policies or initiatives which would have the greatest payoff for climate resilience in the future?
Yeah. Thank you, Arpit, and thank you, Aishwarya, for building such a nice platform. It's more like, when you asked me, it's 2050, and when we look back, what would we want to change would be, or what do I think would make most difference would be the question, actually. So, yeah, so and I have a couple of things to talk about here, because it's a futuristic perspective. It gives me freedom of creativity and how well I can define the future. So, so there are three things. One is the carbon taxation and carbon trade policies, which every country is adopting, is something which I think is going to make a short-term impact, but it would be a huge impact, because we want to. So this is the first time where we're trying to put not really a pressure, but we're giving them incentive for being for being helpful in saving climate. So first time in the history that we are giving them, okay, you can trade off carbon dioxide if you save it. You're also, it's more like before, sometime it was a polluter.
You're saying carbon tax as well as carbon trading.
Trading, yes, I'm saying both. A combination of both. It's more of an emission transaction systems is overall as an ecosystem where we want to reduce the carbon dioxide emission and trade them off. So because we are saving them, it's now giving money to the industrialist, and it makes them happy to not pollute for first time. And so I also understand the government stand in India is because it's more like, we cannot trade carbon right now. We have the carbon trade bill, but we cannot trade it because we want to match up with our 2030 goals and SDGs. So that's also a nice initiative, and keeping it to the level that we don't overrate the whole thing, and we see to what we have to achieve as per capita in India first, and then go for other things. That's one thing. The other thing, in terms of the recent event, which I think will make a lot of difference, is the Boris and Harris campaign that the government, US government, has declared a huge investment that is in partnership. That's called the Partnership for 70 Climate Smart Commodities. So that's the thing. That's a recent development, and I believe it would help other nations to understand, like, if as a power country, if US is now investing. So mostly we see a trend that how the West follows is how we try to follow. So if this is the one where we want to follow, then maybe other countries would like to invest more.
And do you have examples of some of those commodities?
Yes. So Yeah, it's a 2.8 billion investment into just agriculture. And what they're trying to put in there is you can have they're investing into cattle feeds and making it more eco-friendly. They're investing into farming techniques, and so it's more like it is divided into 5 types. And they have given a list of universities and collaborations that they've made. And it's not about just research, but it is now you have to deliver a commodity which would be climate friendly. So that's what I liked about the whole, and it's a partnership. So there are industries also involved. So that made more sense, where it's a public-private partnership and going it into a product, not just research. And because US has its, it has an impression that there was a government who did not really believe in a climate change, and a transition happened where they are investing into climate change is something, as an event, I consider important. So that was the other thing that I wanted to mention. And the third thing is, when it's more of when we talk in the previous panel, professor was talking about financial issues, because if you don't have fund, you cannot do some research. So this was the opening for it. And the third thing that I want to talk is like, it's not a single technology I can pinpoint, but it's more like mainstreaming the circular economy technologies overall. So when we're trying to close the loop, every technology which comes into picture to close the loop is something which I would appreciate after.
So we can perhaps say that, the idea of circular economy applied in technological innovations is probably the game-changing idea in the future.
Yes. I mean, yeah, it's rightly put in words. As it's the thing that I wanted to take a note of. So these are 3 different things. I mean, one was policy, one was an initiative, and one is the technology that I wanted to talk, which will make impact. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive answer, Puri. Let me go over to Ipsa, and Ipsa, pose the same question to you. What are some of the things we should be excited about in the future?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what has already been said by Aishwarya and Purvi, and some of those were things that I was going to say. I won't repeat those, but I think that so the fact that we are looking from now to 2050, I kind of see that. So there's a long game and an immediate game that we're looking at. And so 2050 is rather like the short term, what are the urgent kind of immediate things that we need to get done? And like there's ample evidence. There was an IPCC researcher in the panel before that that establishes that we are due to cross our 1.5 target by 2040, and we will things will just keep getting worse the later, the more we sort of do that. So obviously emissions have to be reduced, and that has to be the main kind of push in terms of what tangible change has to be brought. There are multiple ways of doing that. Carbon trading is one. I would personally argue that it's not the most efficient, but we can sort of talk about that.
Sure, because carbon trading, just for our audience to know, one caveat could also be that there's a lot of carbon traded, but not enough carbon reduced through that trading. So yeah.
Yeah, so just because the pollution is happening in New Delhi and not New York doesn't necessarily mean that it's helping.
That too, it does not really change the geographical distribution of pollution.
Right, exactly. So there is that, but we also need to look at it from the state of the world today, right? So we know that we are rapidly urbanizing, particularly in India and China, which are like the two most populous countries of the world, and the population is also increasing. And so there is definitely going to be a move towards more urbanization. And for those of us who have lived in big cities in India or anywhere else in the world, but I can only speak for India, that the systems are not proper, and there's a lot of inequality between the resources that are allocated, and there's not a lot of participation. So there are two things I want to say there. One is that any climate solution needs to look at building resilient cities, because also there's going to be a lot of internal displacement and migration from areas that are more prone to floods and droughts and other calamities into like bigger centers, because that will lead to loss of jobs. People can't farm anymore, so people will have to find jobs in cities. And so there'll be a lot of drivers pushing people into cities, more so than the normal rate. So urban planning has to play a huge role. And I kind of don't even see it as separate from climate change anymore. Urban planning has to be in line
in
with
the current flood, cities being flooded in North India are a clear example of that. And in South India, like cities like Bangalore and Chennai, the extreme flooding is now become an annual occurrence for about a decade, if not more.
Yeah, and then it brings another host of problems like more increased air pollution and all of those things. So it's just exactly. So urban planning is one, better urban planning. The second thing is like our discourse has to change, right? It has to move from like sustainability to resilience. And I will send a bunch of links in the end, but I learned about this concept through an online course called Think Resilience, which says that our systems have to be resilient, and it has a definition for resilience, which means that if a system is able to bounce back after a shock in a way that its larger sort of characteristics are still maintained, that is resilience. So you can adapt, but you can still be resilient. And so we have to talk about how do we make cities, people, communities resilient to the inevitable disasters that will come. And the third thing is talking, like always rooting this in the idea of inequality. There will always be a disproportionate impact on women, on poor people, on religious minorities, on communities that have been systematically disadvantaged in a way that they don't have the same access to resources or networks that other people do. So in a way, like social justice and innovation kind of has to go hand in hand with any kind of climate work, because climate change is exacerbating all of these problems and is getting exacerbated due to all of these problems. So going forward, like in terms of how you're evaluating social programs and how you're monitoring them, you have to have a climate lens involved within that, and vice versa.
All sort of evaluations.
Exactly, and vice versa. In every climate policy that you suggest, you have to see, okay, what are the gendered impacts of this? Sure. Is this going to work similarly for rural versus urban populations, and so on and so forth. And so one of the and I will plug my capstone project now. But one of the ways that I've seen us coming closest to this is through the practice of permaculture, which is interesting because it is not just practice, it is also a philosophy. And so the practice element of permaculture talks about regenerating soil health, talking about regenerative agriculture and growing our own food and making ourselves more self-reliant. But then there's also the ethos aspect of it, of the kind of principles it pushes, which are very much in line with what we have learned as the characteristics of ecological economics and the managing commons, the principles for managing commons. So it talks about like, how do we bring a shift in our social sort of way of being, rather than just a shift in practice or like in one practice. And rather than taking up more time and talking about all of that, I will just send links to things that I feel have been interesting and very have contributed a lot to my personal learning. And then lastly, what I will say is there are also a couple of links, particularly of podcasts there that talk about local governance. So I do think
public participation in governance, I think, is certainly on my list of policies which would really create greater resilience and climate resilience and in general resilience in society.
Exactly. And that is something that definitely needs a lot more research. Hopefully my 2 years of research will be about this. And 2 years later,
I can send you a consulting project that I did on public participation and governance with the Tompkins County in Ithaca. So I'm happy to send that to you. And in fact, even for the thesis that I wrote, I talked about, how the new model of public administration has moved to public service, which means co-creating, co-implementing, and co-evaluating policies with the people. So I think that's really important. Vikas, I'm going to come to your question, but first let me finish this round of panel discussions, and then we come to question and answers. So let me move very quickly to Anshika. And Anshika, again, the same question to you. What do you think are some of the most high potential ideas for creating climate resilience in the future?
Thank you, Arpit. First of all, it was very enriching to listen to everyone over here. I think, according to me, green bonds have been a very good step in the direction. When they were proposed by a community in Sweden, how we can finance for climate change, because finance for climate is actually one of the most important issues, because the country, even for research, even you need it even to pilot. So green bonds have been really good step in the direction. I think Egypt recently had got a lot of funding for this green bond for green bonds, and they have taken substantial steps. So the International Financial Committee, which actually corporation which finances these green bonds, have certain criteria. Like they will be financing only the renewable projects or the projects which will reduce the climate change impact. So I think this has a potential going forward if more and more people invest into it, because if we finance, if we are putting money into what we are talking about, then things could make a change. Because right now the community is actually struggling for finances. So that's, in my opinion, one of the important decisions. And other one, which I would say, and I've just picked up particularly from Indian perspective, actually from South Asian perspective, was how Himalayans have come, how India and the countries surrounding it have come to realize that we need to safeguard the Himalayas, not just for India, but for across the world and across South Asia. So the steps have been taken, like a Secure Himalaya project, where India is working along with UNDP and other organizations to ensure that the snow leopards are conserved. The other the community there gets livelihood. We are able to maintain the sustainable practices. So I think that's a very good step. Across the world, the communities will have to start safeguarding their own resources like Amazon forest, Himalayas, etc., which we would need to do it because we actually are very dependent on those. So I think that's those two are something, according to me, which are very important. Right.
So it's interesting that you're putting the Himalayan ecosystem at par with the Amazon's ecosystem over there. All right. Well, a great discussion so far. I also would want to add something that Ishwarya had written in the chat box, which was about precision agriculture. I think that's certainly a way of thinking and a way of working, which is going to have tremendous impact in the future, because agriculture happens to be the sector which uses a great amount of energy, great amounts of water resources, and also leads to a lot of emissions generally. So if we are able to transform that sector, that is certainly going to have a great payoff, and precision agriculture is a great way of doing that. In addition to what I may say, these alternative agricultural practices, such as systems of rice intensification, SRI, etc., which does not use fertilizer, which looks at different ways of creating organic crops, cultivating organic crops, and increasing the yield without using all of those chemicals. So I think, those are again interesting ideas to promote and transform sustainable agriculture over there. So now let me open it out to the audience for your questions. I saw that Vikas had a question over there. Vikas, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Sure.
Am I audible?
Yes, and please also introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, I'm Vikas Gupta. I work for an organization called Engineers India Limited, which is into oil and gas consultancy. We are basically oil and gas consultants. And of course, things are moving in the renewable energy sector now. So we are also entering. So my question was directed at basically IPSA, because the use of biochar is not coming up in a big way, in spite of the talk of improving agriculture and making sustainable agriculture. But biochar or biocharcoal is not in the limelight from the government side. What are the reasons for the same?
Sure. IPSA, would you want to take it up?
I can, but thank you for your question. I'll be honest that this is the first I've heard of biochar. I was doing a quick Google search when you sent the question. So I'm by no means an expert or even equipped to answer this question, but I think from what I can understand, that this is like organic matter taken that is put under high pressure and converted into sort of charcoal. That my guess would be that there are logistical challenges preventing us from kind of doing this at a mass scale, similar to kind of like biogas production or something like that. But that's just a first off like guess. I'll have to learn more to give a more intelligent answer, but yeah, I can definitely foresee logistical challenges. Maybe Purvi has something to say, so I'll defer it to her. But yeah, that's all I have. Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you so much, IPSA. And Purvi, over to you.
I mean, we probably are from the similar background. So Vikas sir, hi, thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you for making it. He seems to be a very busy person, and upon invitation is here. So yeah, it's more of his challenges are actual. He works on the field and kind of it. So if I just have to give my view over what you've asked, if I'm not wrong, you are asking us the difficulties that we face from at the government level for biochar usage and all. So I have a couple of answers and a couple of comments to make. One thing is that when we talk about biochar, my usual insight is that we in India, as she said rightly, logistics is the problem for the waste. That is one. The other thing is the consistency of the waste, because we usually would want to have a biochar which made out of more than 60% carbon. So to maintain that consistency of similar kind of slurry, or for anaerobic thing, and for this particular matter to have a consistent waste from agricultural field is an issue. And so that is one thing. Logistic is one thing, and the other thing is when we don't get the feed to keep on running the matter, that's another thing. It's a popular way of doing it in I think in Punjab there are a couple of industries who have successfully maintained their biochar production, and it also is being used, and it is it's actually been promoted by Indian government to be used in soil to improve the mineral content and all of it. So there is a huge market, but I have known constraints about it and functionality of it at large. So that's what I have for today. I mean, we can keep on discussing this later, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Purvi. I think Aishwarya also has something to add over here, so please weigh in, Aishwarya.
Yes, actually, they covered the important technical parts. What I felt would be also a part of answer to Mr. Vikas's question is that India hasn't seen, is not primarily, as of now, is not totally focusing on the transformation from, fertilizer and chemical fertilizers dependent agriculture to an organic agriculture like Sri Lanka did. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka didn't have a transition plan, which, pushed them to the food insecurity which they are facing right now. And India, as of now, we don't have that plan. We are not planning the transition, firstly. And also, as to my knowledge, I know certain startups and also initiatives like the person who is called the Pond Man of India, Ramveer Tanwar, if I'm not wrong. He basically cleans the ponds and processes the biomass, and these have a good potentiality to turn it into the manure, which can be turned as manure, right? Can be used as manure. So they process this biomass in not biochar, but just biomass and use it as manure for nurseries and stuff. But as of now, government intervention in this sector is very, if not zero, it's very less. And I also don't see why government should be the primary, organization to lead this usage of, propagation of biochar as such. Private investors and entities can very well go and, they have less opportunity cost, I would say, than government. So that would be my answer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ishwarya, for that answer. And thank you so much, Purvi and IPSA, for your responses. Mr. Gupta, thank you so much for that really important question. And I hope
Can I put one more question with your permission, just related to the same?
Sure, Dr. Gupta. Can we just check if somebody else has any other question? If not, then I'll just come over to you. If there's anybody else who has a question, please do raise your hand. And if not, then I'm going to invite Mr. Gupta to ask his question once again. All right, I'm going to wait for 3 seconds. All right, over to you, Mr. Gupta.
Like from biogas, we get the digestate, and that digestate can be converted into biofertilizers or the fermented organic manures and liquefied fermented organic manures. So how is this field coming up from digestate to biofertilizer chain? So what is the scenario like? How much is the development taking place, especially in the Indian context?
Okay. Anybody in the panel who might want to touch upon this? And we'll probably just have 4 more minutes to go.
Yeah. So if I could just share my views over it. Yeah. So it's so from thank you. So from having a digester slurry and getting into a manure, there comes a couple of steps where we also have to add some of the solids to make it into a granular format and get it as a manure or fertilizer, because it would have some, we have to go through some analysis and add some nutrients maybe and make it into. So it depends on what kind of waste we have treated and all of it. That's the technical part. In terms of policies, I'm not sure if we have any provision for absolute provision for propagating or helping the field out, or investment proposals per se from the government. So that would be my take on it, that I have not known of the direct policy support from government. So that's one thing. It's different to have a support for biogas generation, but it is different to have support as a part of it. So those two are different technicalities to deal with. So that would be my take.
Thank you. Thank you, Purvi. And I think with this, we would close our discussion for today. We come to an end of our 2022 New York Climate Week event. I would like to thank all of the speakers over here, Purvi, Ipsa, Anshika, and Ishwarya, for your really well-researched and very well-articulated responses. I learned a lot during this discussion, and certainly this discussion gives a lot of hope to me, and I hope to all of the members who were there in the audience. And thanks to the audience members who are spending their Saturday night over here with us discussing about climate change and climate resilience. That gives us hope. Last but not the least, a big thank you to our team, everybody who's here and everybody who's not here right now, because they have really put in the hard work in organizing logistics and organizing, all of the back end that you see, or not see going into this event. So thank you so much. All of the team members, Aditi, Shrishti, Vasi, Aishwarya. Again, a big thank you to all of the first panelists of the first panel. People who want to stay back in another 10 minutes, we're going to take a break of 10 minutes, and then we have the convocation of the GPOTS fellows. So our fellows are graduating. The summer cohort is graduating today, and we are opening applications. In fact, the last deadline to apply for our fall cohort is October 10th, 2022. In order to apply, you need to go to www.gpods.org, and thank you so much, Shrishti, for posting that in the chat box right on cue. And if you want to interact with a lot of interesting mentors from all over the world, a lot of fellows from all over the world, work on interesting capstone projects, and solve some of the toughest problems that we are dealing with in a very practical way, and develop essential skills such as effective writing, planning strategic communication, thinking about circular economy, fundraising, and then systems thinking, game theory, things like that. The fellowship is a home to you. So we look forward to receiving your applications by October 10th. And we look forward to being in touch in general. Now, since you're in our network, we do organize events all throughout the year, and we keep informing you. You'd probably receive a lot of emails from our side. So apologies in advance for spamming your inbox, but do be in touch, and we are always happy to collaborate. We are always happy to talk and engage. Thank you. Good night. And I'll see the fellows and whoever wants to join in the celebrations on the convocation in exactly 9 minutes from now. So bye-bye. Thank you.